We're gonna be okay. I love you.
Oh my god!
Everyone knows the Fallout series, right? Yes, the one about post-apocalypse, dark humor, and plenty of space for roleplay. All of these are memorable elements that made the video game so iconic. But unfortunately, these are exactly what the franchise can't boast today. The Fallout of today is nothing like its renowned predecessors. Today is the day to tell you the story of the rise and fall of the once great franchise. There will be two videos. The first one will mostly focus on the good bits of Fallout's biography, how the original ideology was created, what made it so special, why the fans didn't like the third part, and why New Vegas was so great that it should have been either the last game in the series or the one after which the rights should have been passed on to the devs from Obsidian. So better get in the power armor, grab a minigun, and stock up on Radaway. We've got a long journey ahead of us. Let's roll. The idea of making Fallout stroked the mind of a game designer and programmer named Tim Kaine by accident. That is, actually, there was no idea at all. Tim was just making his game engine. Bosses of the studio noticed that and suggested that the game designer should try out the engine in a video game. But which one? The answer to this question was being considered for quite some time. Amongst all the results of these considerations, there was an idea where the main character travels to the past, kills the ancestor of all humans, then sets off into space. Somehow finds himself in the future, where dinosaurs are in charge, then from there he returns to present day and simply saves his girlfriend. Sounds unfathomably stupid indeed.
What the fuck?
But I would have certainly played something like that. But alas, in the end, the developers have chosen a dystopian story in a post-apocalyptic setting. The gameplay and atmosphere were inspired by XCOM, Westland, and Ultima. From the first one, the developers took the combat basics, from the second one, the ambience of the world after a nuclear war, and from the third one, the roleplay and morality system, which then went to heck in a handbasket. Why not? It's post-apocalyptic, do whatever the hell you want. Such a decision allowed the game to positively stand out against the moral-centered brainchild of Richard Garriott. A few more words about Westland. The developers weren't just inspired by the game, they wanted to make a sequel to it. The delays with the purchase of the rights nipped the idea in the bud, so it was necessary to look for additional visual references in order to preserve the spirit of dying civilization, yet create something unique and not seem derivative to the 1986 game. These references were found in the movies Mad Max, A Boy and His Dog, Forbidden Planet, and The City of Lost Children. If you have seen any of these motion pictures, you can already guess what the developers found in there. Endless wastelands in the first two, laser guns and ridiculous robots in the third one, and strange steam contraptions and monocles juxtaposed with the modern tech in the last one. Such a mix was no longer resembling anything else on the market, so investors didn't even know how to treat the idea. Fortunately, the head of the publishing company, Brian Fargo, saw something in a 1994 prototype that intrigued him. Thanks to him, a small group of developers were given the green light from Interplay Entertainment, although at the time, the publisher didn't even bother naming the group of enthusiasts.
If I didn't care.
At the same time, the enthusiasts themselves were promptly given their ideas an actual form. Recognizable and relatively cheap music by the ink spots for a 40s-50s ambience, and overly advanced atomic energy for freedom of imagination. The result was a world where a man can literally carry an atomic bomb on his shoulder while his levitating assistant robot carries a dozen more. Yet, launching The Witcher 3 was still impossible because, let me tell you, PCs in this world were still pieces of vacuum tube shit. Additionally, the game was given a deep role-playing system. The developers in general, and Tim Kaine in particular, were big fans of tabletop role-playing games, so they were determined to transfer the rules of tabletop games to the virtual space. But it immediately became apparent that D&D wasn't an option. Its rules were suitable for fantasy worlds, not for the joyless future of our planet. So it was decided to take another popular system called GURPS. It was suitable for any world, and the developers already had rights for it. When the first stages of implementing the role-playing system in the game were completed, the developers showed the teaser to the rights holders. After seeing a man in power armor shooting a defenseless man on his knees in the back of the head and waving to the camera afterwards, representatives of Steve Jackson Games, who owned GURPS, were horrified and cancelled the contract. So Kane's team urgently came up with a new system called SPECIAL. We wanted to name the system as well, because at the time people were not only naming their games, but also naming the systems used in their games. And when we lost GURPS, everyone thought like we needed to have a name for the system. And since the system we originally developed had these 7 stats: agility, charisma, endurance, luck, intelligence, perception, and strength, so I said, well, just put them in that order and it spells ACELIPS. That'll be the name of our system. That lasted a day, until Jason Sween, one of the other designers, came in and said, you know, you can rearrange these words to make the word special, and everybody liked that a lot better. I've never forgiven him for that. It was a funny situation indeed, a misfortune that led to a success. Technically, special was no different from GURPS, same skill points which the player can use as he pleases. The difference was in the available number of stats. In GURPS, there were only 4 of them: strength, dexterity, intelligence, and health. So was it a loss or a win for gamers in the end? Most likely the latter, as for me. Try to keep this in mind, because we will get back to it later. We'll do the same with another story. In 1996, Diablo from Blizzard had hit the stores. The game caught the fancy of both journalists and gamers that the publisher started making their own RPGs, resembling a slasher, but with specific loot. Besides, Diablo was a multiplayer isometric RPG, while Fallout was a single-player dimetric one. And despite such a striking difference, the publisher wanted a drastic change of concept. Fortunately, Tim Kaine stood his ground and the project didn't succumb to the trend. The game remained purely single player, and the Y-axis, which was responsible for the building walls, retained a 45-degree angle to the axis. If you didn't catch what I just said, just Google what's the difference between isometric and dimetric projection. It's engineering stuff. And despite my degree, I won't be explaining it here. Otherwise, the video will be unbearably long. All we need to know is that such a projection helped the system in doing calculations by relieving it a bit. All of the above leads us to the following. The original game was created on the basis of elaborate role-playing mechanics, as the main goal of the game was to immerse the player into the new universe. The game didn't go with the trend. This would have contradicted its ideological core. What solo journey in a dead world can we talk about if it's a multiplayer game? The game was created on enthusiasm with a very modest budget. This forced to experiment with the game design and the narrative. For example, animated heads that communicate with the player initially were not as scarce. There was supposed to be about 50 of them. However, time and money expenditures at the very beginning forced the team to temper their ambitions. That's why the gamer sees about a dozen NPCs that have a puppet-like design. Despite the grim ambience, the developers managed to create a truly fun game, the humor of which was largely based on the irrational absurdity of the events. And if the original Fallout didn't fully realize it, because the developers themselves didn't expect such an effect, the sequel was heavily focused on the dark humor, which only added to the game's charm. What is Fallout? Is the dark humor mixed with isolationism. Sounds depressing and boring, but when people played it, they said the process was actually quite fun. So how do you explain that to the marketing specialists? They thought we were making a dystopia that probably isn't gonna be worth the hustle. That almost got the game cancelled. The first project in the series was in development for 3 years. All this time, the developers were fighting either a storm of ideas or the management. When working on the sequel, there were no such problems, but there was a well-coordinated team burning with a desire to create something else in the universe. That's why Fallout 2 came out just over a year later, preserving and multiplying the best from the original. The series wasn't a great commercial success, but it got lots of fans among ordinary players and critics alike, so the game was talked about and its popularity was growing. It would seem, make hay while the sun is still shining, but as it often happens, financial problems arrived. The Black Isle developer studio closed down before finishing the third game. In history, it remained under the operating name Van Buren. President Martin Van Buren, after whom the game was named in the production phase, is known for accomplishing great things despite coming from a very poor family and not knowing English from birth. This only highlights the irony that the game, named in his honor, was unable to reach such great heights. Moreover, it marked the beginning of the dark times in the history of the series, which we will skip. There are plenty of videos and articles about Fallout Tactics and Brotherhood of Steel on the internet. All we need to know is that role-playing mechanics and the universe's canon were hardly present in these games. The ones to promise the return of the original, true Fallout was Bethesda, which acquired the rights to the series in 2004. See now what the title of this section refers to? Exactly. The miracle didn't happen. When Bethesda released the third installment of the famous franchise in 2008, die-hard fans were flabbergasted, to put it mildly. The thing is that the advertising campaign for the game resembled a nuclear war if you take information as bombs rather than the title about nuclear fallout. Why is that? Because 2.5 years before Fallout 3, Bethesda released the fourth part of its Elder Scrolls series, Oblivion. It came out pretty good, but didn't get the same amount of people's love as the third one, Morrowind. The game was criticized for monotonous dungeons, little gameplay variability, and a weak storyline. And of course, those amazing faces from the character creation. How could you ever forget them? The complaints had some solid ground. In Oblivion, the developers' laid-back approach resulted in them copying entire rooms in the dungeons. The gamer noticed that. The fault here was hiding in the distribution of personnel within the team. When an artist is responsible for level design, nothing good will come out. So by the beginning of the development of the third Fallout, Todd Howard decided to reconsider the place of level designers in the team. The developers came up with their own system of level building and called it Spaced Iteration. We talked about it in the Skyrim Phenomena video, so take a look if you need. But in short, the developers would create several models and combine them as they please. This allowed to create different locations using the same elements, which the gamer would grow tired of eventually. After all, the player is not a fool, and he'll notice the hokey pokey sooner or later. So the point is that the first game made with the help of spaced iteration was Fallout 3. It became a testing ground of sorts where Bethesda was practicing for Skyrim. That is, the developers were practicing on a project which then was sent to the stores. What do you think was the result? Endless wastelands full of rocks and identikit car wrecks? That's what. The game could have been saved by the story and good gameplay, but alas. Bethesda's shooting mechanics left much to be desired, so the game was even called Oblivion with Guns. The central plot, although it had some cool twists, neutralized everything with its finale, giving a one-button choice at the end of a multi-level RPG which calls itself heir to the classics. No one expected this from Todd Howard's team in 2008, but that was exactly what everyone got. The day wasn't saved nor by the special system, nor by the actual good atmosphere of post-apocalypse. All the positive aspects were heavily outnumbered by the drawbacks, because Bethesda ran over almost all the pillars of the game design of the classic trilogy with the road roller. The original deep role-playing mechanics remained, but its value was negated by the side quests. Bethesda created the trend themselves and followed it, without coming up with anything new, even for the project that the public had been waiting 10 years for. Okay, they changed the top view to the third or first person view. Still not nearly enough though. Todd Howard always says his team consists only of enthusiasts, but treating the Fallout 3quel as a testing ground for the main franchise speaks negative volumes. Fine, they managed to retain the atmosphere, although weird vampires, huge robots, and children's settlements spoiled it a bit. However, to be honest, back in the day, even these nuances didn't prevent me from feeling all the hardship of surviving in the post-apocalyptic world. How different this world was from the one created by Tim Kaine and his team, I realized only some time later, after having studied the franchise's history more thoroughly. Then, I also tried playing Fallout 2 and realized that it wasn't for me. I was already too much of a new fag. However, the depth of the role-playing mechanics struck a chord with me, and as a teenager, I was obliviously dreaming about something similar, only with a modern twist. How lucky I was that it was 2010 and New Vegas was just about to be released. If the third part buried fans' dreams about the real sequel to the series, then Fallout from Obsidian, imitating the plot of their own game, proved everyone that the corpse was in fact still alive and breathing. It dug the hope from the pit it had been thrown into and showed everyone a whole another wasteland. New Vegas set the community on fire. It was a good old Fallout with a deep role-playing system and, most importantly, a story so varied that the player's actions really affected the world and the story itself. So how did that happen? Well, first of all, it were the developers themselves who were familiar with Fallout, not because their management bought the rights to the franchise, but because they themselves worked on the previous games in the series. The man responsible for the development process was Josh Sawyer, who managed to take part in the development of the cancelled Van Buren, and the head scriptwriter was Chris Avellone. It is to him that we owe certain quests in Fallout 2. The developers were familiar with the vibe of the classic trilogy and promptly rejected Bethesda's groundwork, instead taking some stuff from the stock of Black Isle. Thus, they made a game that was based on the same ideological pillars of game design as the first two parts. Moreover, in some places the game from Obsidian even upgraded those pillars. For example, the role-playing system played a huge part in the gameplay. The developers improved it with more elaborate dialogues. They came up with a method of coherently presenting information to the player after having concluded that the player doesn't need to know everything, but instead needs to concentrate on the central aspects of the chosen path. That is, if the player wants to be evil, he will lead the conversation in this direction, and then the NPC will propose an aggressive way to finish this or that quest. The developers strongly disliked the simplification of the dialogue system, which they saw in games like Mass Effect or in their own Alpha Protocol, so they decided to go against the trend by making the system more complex. New Vegas wasn't that important to Bethesda, so they didn't allocate much money for it. This forced the team to invest more in the role-playing part. The game had fewer situations than Fallout 3, but they had more solutions to them. The developers knew that players like to break the system more than obeying it, so when designing the possible ways for the events of a quest to transpire, they assumed that the player would most likely choose one of the two opposite paths, peaceful and aggressive, as well as the gray zone, which provided opportunities to cheat. This prepared the game for most surprise choices that most gamers would make. The ambience of the original trilogy was still there. The third installment overdid it with the seriousness, and New Vegas managed to bring back and retain the lost balance. Thus, for example, along with the brutal tragedy of Vault 3, where one faction slaughtered its entire population, the player encounters kitschy stories with a guy pretending to be a scientist only by using a lab coat and a pair of glasses, or the one centered around a robot sex worker. Such surrealism is quite in the spirit of the series, because when there's no more hope and the world is going to hell, what else is there to do except to let it all out and laugh? The question, of course, doesn't have an answer. In addition to all of the above, it is worth noting how the developers approached the design of the main quest. They just copied the classic and presented an old working scheme in a new wrapping. Your first and main quest in the game is to find people who shot you in the head and then buried you. Within the first minutes, you get the general vector of the narrative. It will lead you to New Vegas. You are free to go straight to the city, or you can spend some time talking to people who will give you more information about your surroundings. By trying to get more and more information, you will eventually get snowed on their side quests, but you will still have the right to send it all to hell and set off to New Vegas. Such freedom within the narrative resembles this one from the first part, where you also could just leave the vault and go straight to Necropolis, or you could get yourself hooked on a random dialogue and get a new perspective of your adventure. The question of perspective was very important to the developers. Not only the game was now using first and third person view, but the developers made everything so that the player would be able to play as whoever he wants without losing any part of the experience. A hero in shining armor, a complete bastard, or a neutral. All can beat the game. What is there to say? If the Obsidians made it possible to beat the game, even if all of the essential characters are dead. By now, you have probably noticed how much New Vegas has borrowed from the original Fallout trilogy. And that's the point. For the developers, the spin-off wasn't a testing ground, but a way to bring back life and show people the practices that never saw the light of day. So it turns out that in a series of 4 games, where 3 have a number and 1 doesn't, not every part is worthy of using the iconic "war never changes" phrase in the beginning.
War never changes.
After the release of New Vegas, fans hoped that Bethesda would learn from its colleagues and won't make the same mistakes again. But as the future has shown, the number of bad eggs in the franchise will only increase. But we'll talk about that in the second video. Please like and subscribe for more quality content. More great videos about various games are to come. Stay tuned.